China warning it is not afraid of a trade war with the U.S. after President Trump announced plans to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese imports and new export controls on critical software. However, the president also then softened his tone over the weekend, saying everything with China will be fine.
A handshake with the second most powerful man in China, Premier Li Qiang.
Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister will travel to China in a matter of weeks in a move that could signal an easing of tensions between the two countries, locked in a diplomatic standoff.
Those discussions will deepen. I expect to. I will expect at the appropriate time to be meeting with President Xi Jinping.
It began with a quiet decision, one so subtle that most missed it at first. There was no headline, no breaking news banner. Yet that moment would alter the future of an entire continent. For decades, Canada had been the world's steady hand in diplomacy, measured, loyal, and non-confrontational. It was a polite northern neighbor everyone thought they understood, dependable, moderate, predictable. But beneath that calm exterior, something had been simmering. Years of trade disputes, tariffs, and political humiliation had pushed the country to its limit. The breaking point came not with a speech, but with a signature. For over a century, the United States and Canada shared the longest undefended border in the world, a symbol of peace and trust. Their economies, militaries, and even cultures intertwined so deeply that few could imagine one without the other. But the cracks had been spreading. From aluminum to energy, from diplomacy to defense, tension had been mounting quietly. Washington's demands of loyalty began to feel more like chains and friendship, and then America overplayed its hand. The White House announced sweeping 100% tariffs on Canadian exports, cars, timber, aluminum, and even energy. It was meant to be a show of strength, a hardball tactic to force compliance. Instead, it was seen as a betrayal. Factories across Canada slowed to a crawl. Thousands lost their jobs. For years, Ottawa had endured every slight, every tariff, every condescending handshake in silence. But now, patience had run out. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney faced an impossible choice: submit to Washington or protect his collapsing industries. Behind closed doors, his advisors spoke of survival. And one evening, an unmarked jet quietly took off from Ottawa bound for Beijing. No press conference, no announcement, just a handful of senior officials on board in a mission that would rewrite global alliances to end Beijing. The welcome was warm, strategic, and unmistakably bold. China saw opportunity where America saw defiance. The Chinese delegation offered Carney a lifeline: billions in investments, unrestricted access to Asian markets, and long-term partnerships in critical minerals and infrastructure. In short, everything Washington had withheld. But the offer came with a catch. Canada must join China's 500% retaliatory tariffs against the United States. It was a dare disguised as diplomacy. For Carney, the choice was existential: stay loyal and watch Canada crumble, or leap into the unknown and risk its oldest alliance. Days later, the world had its answer. Standing before cameras in Ottawa, Carney's demeanor was calm, almost surgical. "Canada will not be intimidated," he declared. "We will defend our workers, our industries, and our independence." The statement lasted less than a minute, but its shockwaves were immediate to in Washington. Chaos erupted. Emergency meetings filled the Situation Room. Phones rang across NATO capitals. Officials called it betrayal. Pundits called it madness. But Carney offered no further comment. Silence became his message. Then came the leak: a $200 billion economic partnership between Canada and China, covering mining, agriculture, technology, and energy. The deal was unprecedented. Shipments of rare earth minerals, uranium, and natural gas that once flowed south toward American factories were now redirected east toward China's industrial core. Global headlines captured the mood in stark language: Canada turns east. The end of the northern monopoly. Ottawa's quiet revolution. Carney called it economic sovereignty. For many Canadians, it was liberation. Decades of quiet dependency were over. For the first time, Canada wasn't following, it was leading. But in Washington, panic set in. Intelligence briefings warned that Canada's pivot could fracture NATO and destabilize the G7. The Pentagon floated a once unthinkable proposal: limit Canada's access to shared defense intelligence. Two nations that had traded military secrets for generations. That idea bordered on betrayal. In Beijing, celebrations were muted but strategic. Chinese state media praised Canada's courage to choose independence. Investors, meanwhile, poured billions into Canadian energy and infrastructure overnight. Beijing's message to the world was clear. When Washington isolates, Beijing embraces. The economic aftershocks hit the U.S. almost instantly. Detroit's automakers, dependent on Canadian parts, halted production. Construction costs surged. Aluminum and steel prices skyrocketed. What Washington had intended as punishment became self-inflicted pain. Through it all, Carney remained composed. "We're not turning our back on anyone," he told reporters. "We're standing up for ourselves." But privately, he knew the risks. China's deals came with strings, and those strings could tighten at any time. Weeks later, the geopolitical tremor spread. In Europe, government began to question Washington's dominance. Italy and Norway quietly explored trade talks with Beijing. Even Australia, one of America's staunchest allies, started hinting at diversifying its partnerships. For the first time in generations, the world was witnessing a power shift. The United States wasn't losing a battle, it was losing control. Inside the Pentagon, analysts coined a chilling phrase, continental vulnerability. America could no longer assume loyalty north of its border. For decades, Canada had been the quiet constant, the safe ally. Now, it had become the wild card at IN Ottawa. Pride replaced hesitation. After years of economic subservience, Canada was standing on its own. Carney's advisors called it a reset of power, not rebellion, not isolation, but a redefinition of respect. Meanwhile, Beijing wasted no time turning words into reality. Within weeks, new shipping routes connected Vancouver and Prince Rupert directly to Shanghai, Tianjin, and Shenzhen. Chinese cargo ships began docking daily at Canadian ports. Infrastructure crews worked around the clock, expanding rail lines toward the Pacific. Global markets trembled as investors recalibrated. American manufacturing hubs felt the shock most. In Detroit, factory floors fell silent. In Houston, energy exports faced uncertainty. In Seattle, tech companies realized that northern supplies were no longer guaranteed. The tariffs meant to pressure Canada had backfired spectacularly. American consumers felt it in every car dealership, every home renovation, every rising grocery bill. What had begun as a power play became an act of economic self-sabotage to iron the holes of Congress. Anger turned to disbelief. Lawmakers demanded retaliation, but few could agree on how. Canada's defiance had exposed Washington's overreach. The White House faced the uncomfortable truth that its oldest ally had found an alternative, and that alternative was thriving across the Pacific. Chinese commentators described it as the dawn of a new continental order. In Canada, the mood was cautious but proud. The country that once played by others' rules was finally writing its own. The deeper question lingered like smoke. Who gets to define the global economy? One superpower or the nations tired of being told what to do? For Washington, the answer was intolerable. For Ottawa, it was liberation, and as the first Chinese cargo train departed from Vancouver bound for Shanghai, its whistle carried more than freight. It carried a message to the world. The balance of power had shifted. Quietly, decisively, and irreversibly, that IT began as an economic shift but quickly became a political earthquake. Billions of dollars surged into Canada's energy, agriculture, and technology sectors. Projects once frozen under U.S. sanctions roared back to life. Pipelines restarted, battery factories reopened, and rare earth mining expanded at a pace unseen in decades. The North American balance of power was quietly tilting, and for the first time in living memory, Washington was no longer the gravitational center of the continent economy to IN London. Financial analysts began asking if the North Atlantic Alliance itself was fracturing. Europe, weary from inflation and trade pressure, watched Ottawa's defiance with fascination. Some called it the Canadian experiment, a Western democracy breaking from U.S. dominance and thriving on its own terms. In Moscow, smiles spread through the Kremlin. To them, Canada's pivot wasn't just about trade. It was proof that America's era of unquestioned influence was ending. Back in Washington, disbelief turned to anxiety. A senior official admitted, "We thought Canada was our most stable ally. Now we're not sure what side they're even on." For the American public, the shock was personal. Canada had always been the sibling, polite, reliable, almost an extension of home. But that illusion had shattered. The quiet neighbor had dared to say no. Inside the White House, panic set in. Emergency task forces were formed overnight. Advisors argued over whether to reverse the tariffs or double down. Pressure mounted on allies to condemn Canada's actions, but most refused. Even Britain and Germany issued only cautious statements urging dialogue. That silence said everything. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence began noticing something new. Satellite images revealed massive construction along Canada's Arctic and Pacific coasts, expanded ports, new energy terminals, and even fresh airstrips. Many were partially financed by Chinese state-owned companies. To Washington, it looked like commerce. To the Pentagon, it looked like strategy. The question began to haunt every conversation in D.C. Was this really about trade, or was Canada helping China reshape the Western Hemisphere? Carney remained unshaken. His administration issued calm, precise statements, none attacking America directly, yet each one quietly defiant. "We are partners by geography," he said once, "but we are equals in policy." Those three words, equals in policy, echoed across the world. To Americans, they sounded like rebellion. To Canadians, they sounded like dignity. And to everyone else, they sounded like change. Markets responded. The Toronto Stock Exchange hit record highs as Asian investment poured in. The Canadian dollar began rising independently from U.S. trends. Even several Asia-Pacific currencies started aligning with Canada's trade rhythm rather than America's. For the first time in decades, Ottawa was writing its own economic story. But independence carried a cost. As U.S. tariffs tightened, daily life in Canada grew harder. Imported goods became expensive, small businesses struggled, and living costs climbed. Yet Carney's popularity held firm. To many Canadians, short-term hardship was a fair price for long-term sovereignty. In town halls and press conferences, Carney's tone turned reflective, almost poetic. "For generations," he said, "we have lived under someone else's shadow. Maybe it's time we stepped into our own light." The line became a national rallying cry, painted on signs, quoted in Parliament, and repeated in homes across the country. For the first time in generations, Canadians felt the nation wasn't